Professor Mayo, good morning. Welcome to the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy in-person Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom session with my colleague, Jen Fritzsche.
Hello, everyone.
We just wanted to welcome you. Appreciate you coming out in person. I know we're all back to work, quote unquote, as normal, but it's still nice to see everybody in person. So we appreciate you being here. I think we have a couple of folks on Zoom. We're going to go ahead and get started with our keynote speaker. We'll let people fill in as they want. Today's discussion is going to focus on a fairly narrow topic, and that is by design. As you know, Jen and I, once a month, try to focus on one or two very specific issues in our Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom sessions. And what we wanted to do, we have found that we're able to get pretty deep on a topic and have a really good conversation. So we wanted to replicate that here. So rather than cover, the 5 different issues or 5,000 different issues that are often embroiled in a discussion around spectrum, we thought we would be very, very specific. And we raised the question, what would happen if the United States were to become a spectrum island? And the reason why we raised that question today for you is because we are in the advanced planning stages for the World Radio Conference, which is going to convene in Dubai in November. So right now, the focus very much is on what is happening around the world in terms of spectrum policy and where does the US fit into that? Are we going to end up on an island, or will we have harmonized spectrum, which means our devices and our networks can avail themselves of economies of scale for equipment, can be consistent in terms of our customers being able to go around the world, our businesses being able to use these devices operating on the same frequencies, or not? Jen is going to kick us off by hosting our CEO.
Marc, yes. We're excited to, and I'm going to have Kate help me get him in. I'm not sure how to. Marc Ganzi will be joining us via Zoom. He actually just landed in Korea, I believe. And for those of you who don't know, let me just see if I can have him up. Marc Ganzi is the CEO of DigitalBridge. Here he is. Hello, Marc.
Hey, Jen, how are you?
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just giving your introduction. So thank you, Marc, for joining us. I just said you just landed. This is the man who never sleeps and returns every email within maybe a minute. So really thrilled to have Marc Ganzi join us. Marc has some Georgetown family blood. I believe his daughter went here or goes here. But in my relationship with Marc has been, I'd call him the godfather of digital infrastructure, except I think I'm older than him. So he can't be my godfather. But Marc, thank you so much for joining us and really making such an effort to be here.
Well, thank you, Jen. It's a privilege to be back at the university, albeit virtually.
Great. Well, Marc, why don't we just jump right in here? Through DigitalBridge, you have your hands in what I'll call many honeypots of digital infrastructure. You have towers, you have data centers, you have certainly small cells. We always call these your kids. And just right now, we're talking about spectrum as the lifeblood to all these kids. And I'm curious, where do you see the best opportunity? Maybe just some broader picture of the framing out of what you see right now in the digital infrastructure space.
Well, I think, look, you try to love all your kids equally, as we like to say. But the direction of travel on CapEx right now, as we frame the next decade of where capital will be spent, we're in about a 30%, maybe 35% build ratio on 5G. That's about a $1.5 trillion CapEx opportunity. And so far, the sector, Jen, has spent about $550 billion in the preliminary phases of 5G. And as I said, we've spent the last 2.5 years doing what we call the macro overlay of the network. And we're going to move into the densification of 5G networks, which will take, probably another 4 to 5 years. And certainly the macro environment where interest rates are and where free cash flow is for the carriers is probably going to slow down some of that densification effort. And I think that'll be a fairly prolonged cycle of CapEx spending. And as we look out over the next 3 to 4 years, probably there'll be more activity. Will shift from the macro infrastructure, Jen, to small cell infrastructure. And so therefore the capillaries will be the fiber, the the on-ramp and off-ramp for the RF will be the amplifiers and the TMAs and the nodes. And so I think that'll be a big part of the next phase. And I also think indoor densification becomes very important as well. So there'll be a certain amount of CapEx that we spent on bringing signals, low latency signals into indoor environments, whether it's office buildings, whether it's hotels, stadiums, airports. And so it's a long and complicated build. And all of that is against a backdrop that networks are moving to a software-defined environment for the first time. Truly, networks are becoming virtualized. And the carriers in the United States, Jen, as you know, are making a decision between O-RAN and C-RAN. Yes. The 3 major carriers have chosen C-RAN. Dish has chosen O-RAN. We're building for all 4 carriers, and I can't tell you that anyone has a differentiated network advantage. I would also offer to you that, to use your analogy, the honeypot, there are 4 other swim lanes that we think are also very interesting. There's about 1.3 trillion of CapEx that'll be spent in cloud. And so we put that into 2 categories, public cloud and private cloud. Both of those workload environments are growing. And then we think there's another, call it 300 to 400 billion of CapEx that will be spent in IoT networks. Today, there's roughly, Jen, as you know, about 16 billion connected devices that relate to the Internet of Things. We think that goes to 50 billion by the end of this decade. And a lot of that machine-to-machine connectivity will only be amplified in generative AI. As we start having machines talking and machine learning, that's a big white space that I don't think people are really squarely have their eye on today. The 4th area that we're pretty excited about is AI. Today, there's about 3 gigawatts of artificial intelligence compute. There's 3 different reports, Jen, out there from McKinsey, CBRE, and Jones Lang LaSalle. The low end of that build out is 33 gigawatts. The high end of that build out is 38 gigawatts, and the mean is about 35 gigawatts. So let's take the mean, which means there's another 32,000 megawatts of data center capacity that needs to be built and leased over the next 6 to 7 years. So that is a confounding amount of numbers. Let me frame that for the audience contextually. We're in the 10th year of the public cloud. So in 2013, we started building public cloud infrastructure for the hyperscalers. Today, that market today is 13 gigawatts of in-place compute power. So it took us 10 years and about $3 trillion to build the public cloud to where it is today, which is 13,000 megawatts. Now in AI, Jen, we're being asked to triple that capacity in the next 7 years to the end of the decade. So that's a pretty big opportunity. If I was sort of, again, using the honeypot analogy, that is the biggest honeypot because there is a material amount of CapEx that's going there. So we're spending a lot of our energy there. The 5th opportunity that we can certainly talk about today is LEOs. So low Earth orbiting satellites, which is really Starlink and OneWeb are kind of the 2 major players. OneWeb is going to ultimately carry the Kuiper network for Amazon. And then, of course, Starlink, everyone I think knows in the room what Elon's doing. 25,000 satellites in place today. His plans to get to 100,000 satellites. And alongside of that, Jen, comes a massive amount of ground-based, what we call terrestrial infrastructure. In the old days, Jen, you would have called it teleports. But imagine today, those teleports are about 1,000 to 2,000 locations. It is a small data center. It's an edge data center. It's fiber, a small tower for the transmit and receive side of it. And so there's another area where another 400 billion of CapEx will be spent in wireless, in infrastructure. So difficult macro backdrop today that's confusing, high interest rates, inflation, a lot of confusion around liquidity and where the market goes. but yet here we have these 5 amazing secular tailwinds to think about, of which 5G is only one of those 5 tailwinds where we're, as an investment team, that's where we're spending our energy and time.
Got it. And, it's interesting, Marc, you mentioned 5G at the end there, but all of this kind of leads each of these tailwinds, and I'm going to even include data centers. It kind of leads back. Wireless is going to be a huge part of that. Spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless. We all know that. A large part of our focus today is talking about the spectrum pipeline or lack of it. And I guess we know you do not own spectrum. How do you view that as an infrastructure? And maybe if put that aside, if more spectrum's not coming down the pipe, how do you see that as a good thing or bad for your business?
Well, you can make both arguments, Jen, and we've historically have stayed out of spectrum. And the reason for that is we believe there are sort of 4 tenets to infrastructure, digital infrastructure. It's a long-term lease. It's typically owning the fee, which is land. It's having some sort of very specific building permit associated with that, which creates the strategic moat. And ultimately the ability to put multiple customers into that infrastructure, so shared infrastructure. And those are kind of the 4 walls of underwriting in digital infrastructure. Spectrum sadly sort of falls out of that box.
Right.
It doesn't tick enough of the boxes for us to go to some of the world's largest LPs and say, we want to park your capital into these ideas. Because remember, infrastructure is about long-term cash flows. And spectrum really doesn't set up well for that. There's a lot of value in spectrum. A lot of our business models are predicated on spectrum. And certainly we'd like a world where more spectrum is put out. Why? It creates innovation. It allows our customers to buy more spectrum. It allows them to deploy new radio technology. And certainly in a converging world, in a software-defined world, where data centers and fiber and towers all work together, you can make the bull case that more spectrum creates, in essence, more infrastructure and more opportunity. Now, there's another case of that, which is limited infrastructure requires you to do more frequency reuse. And so when you're reusing frequency, that means you're densifying and you're trying to use that spectrum in a more narrowly defined environment where you can reuse it over and over and over again, which means more macro sites, more small cell infrastructure, more C-RAN hubs, and that certainly could be good for us as well. So what I always like about digital infrastructure is we don't have to make that call. We don't have to make a technology bet. We are, in essence, a Switzerland per se in the arms race. And look, some of our customers have deep spectrum positions, and some of our customers have very weak spectrum positions. So nonetheless, we work for all of them. We do work for all the major carriers, and we do work for all the major hyperscalers. And then, of course, from a fiber perspective, we have literally, close to 40,000 clients that use our fiber networks every day. So I'm somewhat, again, neutral on this position, but as an entrepreneur, I'd certainly like to see more spectrum get out there, and I'd like to see this current sitting FCC be a bit more progressive.
And Marc, I want to ask you about the state of the carriers. You, again, deal with all of them. The tower stocks, public stocks have been rocked. I mean, just at all kind of what I've seen in my career, multiple trading at lowest multiples I've ever seen. A large part of that certainly can be explained with higher interest rates, but the carrier environment has been pretty weak in terms of spending. Would you agree? What are you seeing? What's your outlook there?
Well, we've seen a 25 to 30% cut in CapEx this year. So that obviously has hurt the 5G sort of overlay in terms of macro designs. That being said, on a global basis, Jen, through the end of the second quarter, we are up 14% year over year. Now, keep in mind, we own 9 tower companies around the world. So my purview here is not just in the narrow focus of the United States and the FCC. We have material businesses here in Asia. We have a big tower company that owns about 18,000 towers. We've got businesses in Brazil. We have an Andean business, a Mexican business, a Finnish business, a UK business, a Belgian business, a German business. And then, of course, we have a big, large, sizable US business, the largest private cell tower REIT. So what's interesting to me is we've had very strong growth in Southeast Asia. We're putting up double-digit organic growth as they deploy 5G technology. Certainly in places like Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Mexico, they're just now rolling out the overlays on 5G. So we're kind of in the first year of the introduction of 5G equipment in the emerging markets and what I would call non-OECD and OECD economies. So, for example, one of the great surprises this year has been Brazil and Peru. Those are two markets that have done incredibly well for us. Mexico has had a pickup in leasing, and Colombia and Chile are coming along as well. At the same time, in Europe, we've posted roughly about 5% organic growth in our German business. Our Belgian business, Belgian Tower Partners, posted 6% organic growth. Our Finnish business, Digita, will put up about 4.5% growth this year. And then our fastest growing tower companies, our UK tower business, Freshwave, which is a hybrid tower small cell operator. And that business will put up about 25% organic growth this year, because the carriers are really turning to Freshwave because they don't have any CapEx to spend, and Freshwave is stepping up and building that infrastructure. So that's an interesting market, the UK, because the carriers are so hurt and wounded, they don't have discretionary CapEx. But if you put up the discretionary CapEx, you can get the customers to jump in and sign leases. So, and then last, in the US, Alex is on a glide path to do about 8% organic growth, which will be ahead of American Tower, Crown, and SBA.
That's
vertical. And this is Vertical Bridge.
Yeah.
And they've had a relatively good year. Alex is, last year was about 11% organic growth, almost 12%. So he's going to put up 8 to 9% growth this year, which we had telegraphed. We believe that carriers were going to cut their CapEx. So the world is a complicated place, and there's a lot happening in terms of carrier CapEx. But I would tell you unequivocally, the market that has been hurt the most from a CapEx perspective is probably Europe first and the United States second.
Okay, because that was my question. It's interesting. I thought you were going to say US first, because you have a dialogue with all the C-suites of the carriers. Are you sensing they are kind of deer in headlights? We need more spectrum. Deer in headlights. We got to watch our balance sheet. What's driving their kind of hesitation? US.
It's about the balance sheet right now, Jen. It's 100% around the balance sheet and managing long-term liabilities. Mm-hmm. I was with John Stankey last week in DC, and he and I had we were talking at a conference around rural broadband, and we had a chance to visit alone for about 20 minutes. And the number one challenge with AT&T right now is obviously they're in the middle of a massive consumer fiber build, which is really strategically important to John. For the first time, AT&T is taking external capital in the form of BlackRock to help them build some of this, residential fiber outside of their RBOC footprint. And that is a big strategic priority for AT&T. Mm-hmm. A secondary priority is densifying the 5G network. And so John knows he's got certain liabilities that are coming due. He's got non-core assets like his satellite TV business, like Mexico. There's things that he prioritizes that are, non-strategic. But at the end of the day, AT&T is really going to be focused pretty myopically on the consumer. Mm-hmm. And the consumer will be obviously the fiber to the home product. It'll be the wireless product.
Yes.
And ultimately, AT&T, while it cut CapEx, they still have a very active plan for macro sites and small cells that they will deploy in 24, 25, and 26. And so while liquidity and balance sheet and liability management remains John's top priority, at the same time, they're still going to deploy billions of dollars of CapEx this year and next year and into 2025.
Yes.
Spectrum is not super high on John's list right now. And if you canvass the other three CEOs, obviously Charlie feels like he has the best spectrum position. He's pretty forward leaning about that. And I would say Mike Sievert feels like that, T-Mobile has the best spectrum position they've had in a long time through Sprint. And I think Hans even feels, like he has a good spectrum position. Certainly, Hans would like more spectrum and would be active if there were auctions. Verizon, as you know, is always active.
Yes.
And, Hans is kind of a wireless first guy, which is sort of a flip against where Stanky is. And, he's a radio engineer by trade. So you can always count on Hans wanting to be aggressive on spectrum acquisitions and wanting to build his spectrum arsenal. But I don't think any of the 4 CEOs today look in the mirror and say, I don't have enough spectrum to run my business the way I want to run it today.
Okay.
But I don't think any of them think their businesses are future-proof, Jen, from a spectrum position.
Right. Okay. Well said. I do want to, you touched on being in DC last week. And from what I understand, it was a lot on, introducing Alex to the Wireless Hall of Fame, of course, but also you spoke on closing the digital divide. And I do want to talk a little bit about DigitalBridge's role there. I mean, this has been a focus for you, I would say, even well before COVID, if memory's serving me correctly.
Yes. Yeah, no, I've been super focused on this. I think there is a big opportunity to bring broadband equality into, particularly into the metro areas. I know part of the Build Back Better, Biden proposal on broadband is to go hit rural communities. I don't really think we have a terrible problem in rural America around connectivity. I think the bigger problem sits in really in the urban core, where you have, homes with, household income below $48,000 that have children that don't have access to the internet for schooling. And this is a problem. And I've shared this, Brian Roberts at Comcast shares this as well. He's put literally close to $400 million into, creating centers where in difficult neighborhoods, kids can get onto the internet and get access to broadband communications. We do have an inequality gap when it comes to broadband communications. If you look at cable company and fiber overbuild maps, they stay away from the markets where they don't feel like they can get the right return on invested capital. And I think that they have that choice, right? Cable cos and fiber broadband providers can choose where they want to build if they're outside of franchise. So, we have to give incentives for them to build in those neighborhoods. And then in further to that, you have to create an easy on-ramp for those consumers to get access to the internet. I do think that is a big challenge for the country. And my hope is that the, Build Back Better bill will address that. Because right now it's heavily oriented to NTIA. And as you know, Jen, the way that money works in Washington is once it hits NTIA, it goes into the state vortex. And the states are incredibly provincial in terms of how they give out broadband grants. And you have to remember, most of those broadband grants, close to 80 to 90% of those broadband grants are going to go to the incumbents because they own the state lobbying in those particular states. They have control of the PUC, and they're ruthless in terms of how they get the funding. So a lot of that funding will eventually end up in the hands of the Lumens, the Windstreams, the AT&Ts and the Verizons. And my hope is that those folks will innovate. They're not known for innovation. They're not known for taking a lot of risk in terms of bridging that digital divide. And so we tend to have this pattern in Washington of making the same mistakes over and over again. And I think there's going to be a big missed opportunity here, because the way that bill's been defined and the way the NTIA is thinking about it is solely from a fiber perspective. And fiber is only one arrow, in the quiver to bridge the digital divide. Wireless is a fantastic product when you move into communities, sub 2,000, 3,000 people, as you know.
Yes.
So that ability to deliver broadband services, particularly in 5G, you can deliver a home broadband quality product with 5G in a rural setting. And so what we're trying to push on is we're trying to make sure that the FCC understands that ultimately it's not just all about fiber. It's not about putting plant in the ground. You have to have multiple solutions to solve these problems. The third thing we've said is we've been very clear about training. We believe there is a massive talent gap in terms of how we're building out our nation's infrastructure. And most of the CEOs in our sector will tell you, as we build out more fiber and we go out and we look to proliferate networks and densify them, we have a massive shortage of talent in the fiber side of the business. And so I wanted to create, Jonathan Adelstein and I had proposed that the NTIA provision off to the side, $4 to $5 billion for training, vocation-based training, where we're teaching skills that ultimately that young students that are perhaps not quite at the education level of a Georgetown or an Ivy League school or other elite colleges, but putting capital into university systems where we can train people to be tower technicians, train them to be fiber technicians, data center technicians. And these are good jobs, Jen, as you know.
Yes.
These are jobs that pay well in excess of over $160,000 to $180,000 per year coming out of college. And you just don't have enough of these engineering jobs out there. And so one of the challenges that we have at businesses like Zayo and DigitalBridge is we can't hire people fast enough to keep up with the demand of the digital infrastructure. And so I've been very vocal about training. I've been very vocal about retooling our military when veterans retire, giving them a path and a stipend to go back to school and get trained. Some of our best employees have come from, Wireless for Warriors, as you know, is a program that WIA launched when I was the president of WIA. And it was specifically about putting military personnel that have come back. They're no longer fit for service. They've retired out of service. Well, how do we put them into good jobs so they don't end up depressed? They don't sit in VA hospitals. Well, you put them to work. You give them a mission. You give them an assignment. So I'm a big believer in making sure that government takes a hand in retooling our economy and making sure that we're training our Americans for the next great jobs. Not the sit in a fast food restaurant and make $32,000 a year type of job. We need to get people to aim more aspirationally higher at being ready for the next wave of this economy, which will be a digital economy.
And do you get the sense that the FCC and others are listening and being front-footed in those conversations?
No.
Okay.
I don't.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. We're a little too immersed in the politics of the politics.
Yeah.
I think we have a great sitting chair. Jessica knows exactly what she's doing. She's really smart. She's very capable. I served at JPI for an extended period of time and through 3 different presidents, and we were always able to get stuff done. I think that was a sitting FCC chair that really didn't care about red or blue. He was sort of purple, and which was evidenced by the fact that Obama put him in the chair, and he served under Trump, and he really just honestly, I think it did a great job just trying to advance the goals of wireless communications and to advance industry at the same time. And so I was happy to have served on his broadband advisory board and with other industry leaders, and I think we proved that we got a lot done during that time period. Yes,
you did. Marc, we're going to let you go to sleep, but I have one last question here. During my years in analyst, I found that the trends, there was kind of a gap between DC and Wall Street and what to bridge that gap. I'm curious if you have the audience right here. What is a message you'd like to deliver that we're seeing in terms of capital deployment, interest rates? What would you say is the trend you're seeing in the Wall Street world that maybe is not fully appreciated in the room, in the city I'm sitting in?
Well, I think the biggest trend right now has to be ultimately the debate around AI. And this is the debate that we wage in our investment committees. We talk about it with our LPs. And the velocity and the speed at which AI is being built, and ultimately how the private sector is deploying that technology with minimal government interference, I think is really interesting. While there's a fury of debate around spectrum and there's a fury of debate around net neutrality, To me, that's not the issue right now. The issue is ultimately, how do you govern the hyperscalers? And the amount of power that the hyperscalers possess in terms of the ultimately, obviously, the artificial intelligence networks, but the control of the public cloud, and who is ultimately going to be the regulator of the public cloud and artificial intelligence networks. It's interesting that those companies have gotten a pretty good hall pass so far, because the cloud operates across borders. As you know, Jen, it doesn't have really the cloud doesn't have a domicile per se, or a sovereignty that it ties itself to. Data sovereignty, certainly Europe has been a lot more progressive, Jen, on data sovereignty than the US. I almost feel like we're asleep at the switch on data sovereignty. And I would turn it back to the young minds in the room that are probably smarter than me, which is, what are the ideas that that students have today around this concept of data sovereignty, and ultimately, how do you govern artificial intelligence networks? I think this will be a debate, Jen, that'll be waged over the next decade. And the question is, if this technology moves faster than we think it'll move, from language-based learning models into inference, and ultimately getting into 5th and 6th generation generative AI applications, it's really hard, Jen, to put that genie back in the bottle. And I think as we're on the front end building these networks, we're super cognizant of that responsibility. And we know how difficult it's going to be to control those networks. But again, turn it back to the classroom. What are some of the ideas in the room about how we control AI? And ultimately, how do you gain control of the hyperscalers who have total control of the public cloud? These are the things that I think that we'll be talking about for time to come. And I'm also happy to answer any questions before you dismiss me. But I did offer that I would give 15 minutes for Q&A. But anyone that has some great ideas on how to regulate generative AI and how to regulate the cloud, they probably should apply for the FCC right now.
I guess just last question I would ask you, if you're AT&T, Verizon, et cetera, do you think of Microsoft as a competitor?
Well, they're certainly a frenemy, right? They are using your network. They are getting a pretty good deal on the network. I think this is one of the great grievances of Verizon and AT&T, which is that the cloud players have basically enjoyed a free ride on the network, and perhaps the current sitting chair's stance on net neutrality, that may get worse for the carriers. I do think there is a monster burden on the RBOCs in terms of the infrastructure that they have to maintain in a regulated environment. And that burden and that standard is quite high, Jen. And so they have to continue to keep putting CapEx into the network. And the hyperscalers get to enjoy that network in essence, for free. Other than the interconnection and the fiber that they pay, they do get pretty much a free ride across all of the carriers' mobile networks. And so I think they're getting the better end of that value proposition today. The question is, at some point, will the FCC recognize that? And do you create some sort of cloud-based tariff on the cloud players in terms of the utilization of those networks? That's, again, another monster debate. And I think, there was a rush, 7-8 years ago, for all the mobile carriers to tie up with various cloud players and create partnerships. But the cloud guys were so far ahead of the 3 major telcos, the 3 major wireless carriers. And in cutting those partnerships, they thought by getting access to the public cloud for their customers, really what they should have been thinking about was, how do I monetize public cloud on my wireless devices? And unfortunately, again, that's another situation where the ship was set sail, impossible to sort of put the genie back in the bottle.
Got it. Well, Marc, we are going to let you go. You answered many questions, and we can't thank you enough, really, for carving time out of your incredibly challenging schedule to make this work. Thank you, as always, Marc. You're awesome.
Not a problem. A pleasure to be here. And thanks to the Georgetown community as well. Appreciate it.
All right. So we will have our second guest is going to be teleporting in. I just wanted to say that. Clete Johnson, there he is. Hello. Can you hear us? All
Yeah,
right.
I can hear you loud and clear. Yeah, good to be here virtually.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for teleporting in. We just heard from Marc Ganzi, who was joining us from South Korea. I'm thinking maybe you're not quite so far away.
Not so far away. Greetings from North Georgia. And I've been traveling around and was not able to make it to DC this week, but I'm glad to be here virtually via the power of modern networks.
Thank you very much, Clete. So everyone, this is Clete Johnson. He is from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he and a colleague of his at CSIS have recently published over the last couple of months a series of papers that take a look at the question, is the robust nature of 5G, 6G going forward related at all to national security? And if so, where does spectrum fit into that equation? And so we thought this was a particularly interesting perspective in light of our overall topic, which is, could the US end up on a spectrum island? And so, Clete, thank you very much for joining us. As I said, if you wanted to maybe supplement my very, very cursory overview of you and your research before we start into a discussion.
No, sure. Thanks so much, Carolyn and Jen, and the whole Georgetown community. This is a very important topic. I come to it from I'm not a spectrum engineer. I'm at this point a telecom and broadband and internet security attorney, but I spent most of my career on the hard security side of security policy. Starting out with the U.S. Army, I was a logistics officer in the late 90s when the world was changing with the internet and supply chains and China technology, and then in the intervening years, working on defense and foreign policy and international trade issues in the U.S. Senate on the Senate Intelligence Committee and at the FCC. And then commerce before coming to CSIS, and in my day job, I'm an attorney at Wilkinson Barker now, or a telecom tech firm. So my entire view of the spectrum policy issues and the debate that often kind of devolves into a commercial interest versus national security dichotomy that we think is a false dichotomy, it comes from security and the intersection of hard security issues like counterterrorism, great power dynamics, both of which we've seen quite a bit of unfortunately in the last couple of years, in particular the last week, and on one hand, and then the digital security and digital information environment on the other. So that was the focus of the series of papers that Jim Lewis and I put forward. Love to dive into that, but that's the big backdrop, is how do the traditional security issues interface with the digital era, number one, and then number two, what role does spectrum play in that? It's not intuitive, but it is deeply integrated into the future security, strategic security strategies that the United States and our allies are putting together. So that's the series of papers, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what we have in store in the coming months. But I'll just leave it at that for right now, Carolyn.
Thank you very much. So suffice to say, he knows things. And he's also at my alma mater, Wilkinson Barker, so I always have a soft spot in my heart for Clete. So just as factual context, 5G is what everybody's talking about these days, but this is equally applicable to 6G as we're starting to see countries around the world make decisions about what that spectrum should look like, that their companies will need to begin building out 6G. So in terms of licensed spectrum, for purposes here, we're going to talk about licensed in the sense of it's full power, usable for commercial purposes. So it's scalable, high power, large geographic areas. Right now, in terms of mid-band, which is the sweet spot for 5G and the capabilities that 5G has, you've got China is at 1,320 megahertz. The United States has 450. As opposed to unlicensed, which is typically lower power, smaller geographic areas. Think of Wi-Fi, very localized. China has allocated 325 megahertz, the United States, 1,905. So as I said at the very beginning, the reason why we chose this topic for this point in time is because the country and countries around the world are looking at preparing for the WRC, the World Radio Conference that's happening in November. We're going to hear more about that from one of our speakers, Ambassador Gross. However, at this international gathering, different countries have different agendas that they'll be prosecuting. And the reason why we thought it was important to hear from Clete is the various representatives of the US government will be there in addition to industry. And one of the largest holders of spectrum in the United States, and therefore a very interested stakeholder in all of these discussions, is the Department of Defense. So with that, if you could walk us through just sort of your high-level concept of the relationship between a strong economy and a strong military, and then maybe we can get into the specifics of what you guys found in your analysis.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'll just start with a very big picture. The U.S. and our allies' strength, and really going back 100 years, has always been the combination and the integration of commercial strength and military strength. They are deeply intertwined, deeply interrelated. They always have been, really going back to the U.S. Civil War, where the industrial strength of the United States ultimately defeated the Confederate States, and that was these two concepts are inseparable. You can think about the arsenal of democracy in World War II, where ultimately the industrial capacity and strength and dynamism of the United States, and the fact that the United States was the originator of go back into the supply chain and assembly line dynamics that Henry Ford innovated, but it was General Motors and Ford and Detroit that helped us overcome the industrial strength of Nazi Germany. And that's a great simplification, but I'll give you two examples from when I was a lieutenant in the late 90s. The Department of Defense and Walmart together revolutionized global shipping and supply chain management by requiring their largest contractors and suppliers, in Walmart's case, vendors and contractors in DoD's case, to put RFID tags on their products that they were shipping. This cost a lot of money, and there were a lot of people in industry that didn't want to do it. I think it cost Procter and Gamble something like $120 billion over time, over a certain period. I'm sorry, 120 million. 120 billion would be much larger, but it was a very substantial investment for anybody who shipped to Walmart or DoD. But over the course of about 5 years, and in concert with the internet revolution, it completely transformed global shipping, along with things like standardized containers and pallets. And this is a good example of the U.S. military and its capabilities, working with U.S. industry and its capabilities to dramatically advance U.S. interests, where commercial interests and national security interests are in many cases the same thing. In other cases, just overlap quite a bit. And so this is something that we've seen throughout history. It becomes more and more and more acute the more that technology that often starts in the commercial sector or academia, or can start in the defense industrial community and move out into commercial applications. It's a symbiosis between these two worlds, primarily in the United States, but increasingly among the U.S. And its allies. Think about the integration between the U.S. and Korean defense industrial base, for instance. This is our great strength. It's what none of our adversaries, including China, have, and this is what we need to maximize. So, just to foreshadow what we'll talk about on Spectrum, what we want to do in Spectrum with this series, that the paper series that we've already completed, and then a series of workshops that we're going to be undertaking beginning this month. We want to seek to maximize spectrum use and efficiency for the benefit of U.S. interests, and those include commercial interests and national security interests, some of which are not only in parallel but identical. We want to move beyond the view of spectrum as scarcity. It is an invisible natural resource. Much like the radio wave version of fiber, you might look at it like that. And it is a finite resource, but we should look at it as a resource for the United States and its allies to maximize, not to fight over as a scarce resource. So that's what we'll be digging into.
Right. So just to put it in, plain English, taking it out of the policy space, how the heck is spectrum policy with respect to 5G commercial networks part of a national security conversation? I mean,
it's a great question. Yeah.
Economic relationship, but how does spectrum get involved?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not intuitive, but it is also not it's not hard to grasp if you think about the way the world works now. And I'll go back to to something that Marc said earlier about AI and the future of the public cloud. AI can exist because of data. The more data you have, the more models can be run, and the more precise the algorithms can become. And this is the great difference between the way the world existed 100 years ago and the way it exists now and will exist increasingly in future years, as a world of almost total information awareness. That's an old term from back in the day that has a bad connotation. And this is the more data there is, the more sensors that are connected, the more data that is being collected into the cloud for good purposes or mundane or neutral purposes, the more AI can shape the information environment and thereby shape the security environment. And it sounds a little bit abstract, but to make it concrete, if U.S. policymakers and U.S. and allied policymakers are concerned about Huawei and TikTok, as I think they should be, then they should be concerned about what the future looks like if China and its authoritarian, I wouldn't call them allies because they don't act as allies in the same way, but its authoritarian supplicants and partners like Russia, Iran, North Korea, if those authoritarian governments have so-called national champions like Huawei and ZTE and TikTok and Alibaba, et cetera, that dominate the future commercial environment, then they will also dominate the data environment. They will dominate AI. They will dominate the 21st century. And this is what Marc was getting to. AI will underlie everything in the future, from military force projection to information awareness, augmented reality, virtual reality, and that connects to the physical world in a way that is it's extremely it's an inseparable nexus. For instance, between what the Russian population thinks about the war in Ukraine and how long that war lasts. And so the more data that is out there, the more data that is in control of authoritarian regimes, the more that they can control the information environment and therefore control societies. There's a lot more to discuss on that, but that is why spectrum is related to security, because spectrum is the invisible natural resource that allows 5G and later 6G, and 5G and 6G are the capabilities that will produce exponentially more data, digital data, than has ever existed in human history. There's no parallel to the digital data and the information awareness that exists now and that will exist 5-10 years from now. So if China dominates the spectrum environment, they dominate that natural resource, and they can build the tech environment around that natural resource such that national champions like TikTok and Huawei control the networks that control our future. And that will not be a good thing. In my view, and this is something we wrote in the papers, if that happens, there are no technology bans, there are no rip and replace programs, there are no weapon systems that can adequately defend US and allied interests if that scenario plays out. So that's why spectrum is so important.
Well, that doesn't sound very good. So as I said at the beginning, Defense Department and various and sundry pieces of the military and other federal agencies, of course, are the largest holders of spectrum in the United States. And that is where, as I think most of you know, the commercial industry is trying to identify additional bands that make sense for the industry to innovate into because of where current operations and networks and what networks are operating now. So as I think many of you realize, we are here inside the Beltway, no pun intended, at a bit of a deadlock where the largest holder of spectrum, despite congressional direction, has simply said, listen, what we're using spectrum for is just too important to tell you what we're doing with it, and just trust us, we need it. However, the United States, in keeping with that, is heading into something called the World Radio Conference, lacking a cohesive agenda in terms of pushing for additional bands that could be made available on a harmonized basis for the U.S. to operate on, consistent with what other countries are doing. And so all of that to say, Clete, how do we break the logjam? How do we make progress? And how do we make it clear, not just with the Pentagon, but with all the other stakeholders, including defense contractors, that this is not a zero-sum game, that our objectives align. We all are going to be looking to spectrum-based solutions for a variety of issues and to continue to grow the economy. So how do we develop that level of trust where we can sit at the table together and actually partner to try to find a way to make all of this work?
That's the question of the day. That's what we're going to be digging into in the workshops that are coming up. We're trying to help, and this is CSIS has a great history of pulling together various stakeholders. We'll be pulling together folks from government, both the so-called civilian agencies like NTIA and FCC, and the White House and DoD. And along with folks from industry, from the wireless industry, from the defense industrial base. We're going to pull everybody together with a frame of, okay, how do we get beyond the zero sum? We recognize everybody wants and more importantly needs the spectrum that's available. It is a finite resource, so how do we maximize its use for the benefit of, number one, the United States and its allies at a grand strategic level, and then number two, for the private interests, both in the defense industrial base and in the wireless industry, and all the other industries that grow out of those two large industries. How do we maximize those interests? And it's going to be hard to do, because when there is a finite resource, it's really kind of the natural default setting is to fall into this zero sum trench warfare of there's only so much of it. So if sector A gets a certain percent, that means sector B only gets 100% minus sector A's percent. And but what we're looking to do is look at ways that this so-called static sharing can be maximized. Static sharing means geographic sharing, where a certain spectrum band can be used by so-and-so stakeholder here and another stakeholder over there. And because of AI and because of technology advances, there are some very significant advances in the precision of geographic sharing. In some cases, there are some we can maximize just frequency-based sharing, where you make better use of the spectrum that's available in that frequency. There are some cases where temporal sharing may be used. But as Carolyn kicked this off, the lifeblood, so to speak, of the 5G economy is licensed, so-called full power. And for those that are not immersed in the telecom jargon, full power means wide area coverage, so that where a cell phone or a device can access that spectrum from a wide, a long way away from the cell tower, so to speak. I sort of look at that as those are the primary arteries of the 5G economy. Licensed spectrum are the big arteries that nourish the 5G ecosystem, whereas the unlicensed is much more local. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, other things like that might be seen as the capillaries that take the nourishment to a much more local level. Both are indispensable, and the United States needs to lead in both. And we have much more access to. We lead the world in unlicensed access, which is one of the reasons that we're the leading innovators in that world. And we need to do the same on the license side. Likewise, we need to continue to lead the world in the sophistication, force projection of our defense and weapons systems. And so, as an army vet, I want to, and I think somebody might have a mic on. Sounds like there's some. There we go. As an army vet, I just want to be crystal clear. These weapon systems that use spectrum that are, many cases developed, most cases developed by the defense industrial base, these are indispensable to our defense. I don't think anybody is saying one thing is more important than the other. I think what we're saying is national security depends on both weapon systems and commercial dynamism and strength. And that's what it's not a bifurcation. And when you hear, just remember recent testimony from Secretary Austin, who I admire very greatly, and former chair of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, who I also admire greatly. They would refer to spectrum issues as economic growth versus national security. And I just think that's not the right frame. I actually think that's a very dangerous false dichotomy, because national security consists of both weapon systems and defense systems and our commercial dynamism. And if we lose our world lead in either, we're at great risk. And we need both. And that's what we'll be digging into in the CSIS workshops. How do we get both? And we presently lead, and Marc also said another point, that right now the major carriers are presently deploying and digesting the spectrum that they have, the licensed spectrum that they've acquired in recent years. This is really not, it's not an immediate, this massive spectrum gap with China is not an immediate here and now threat, but it is a near-term, midterm threat. We're talking, a few years from now, that massive gap, if we don't start closing it, will start showing up in the market in ways that frankly that advantage the PRC and Chinese Communist Party supported national champions, and basically change the global market to for telecom and tech services and products to favor these authoritarian approaches. So it's not going to, we're still in the lead right now. I would never bet against American and allied dynamism and leadership. But if China is dominating spectrum, 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now, it's a very dangerous dynamic, particularly when you look at the very real hard security challenges and challenges understates it. And we've seen in Israel what happens when adversaries align and attack, and the same thing with Russia and Ukraine. There's a I don't know if it's an axis yet, but there is a collection, an authoritarian alliance developing between China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Add Hamas to that, and those are our adversaries in the physical security world, and they're also our adversaries led by China in the digital world. And we need to lead in both.
Well, you were talking just a minute ago about nourishment, and we do have coffee and treats for everyone, but I wanted to break here for a quick second and ask, does anybody have any questions for Clete while we have him online? Sure, please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm a graduate student at the McCourt School. Clete, thanks for talking to us. You paint a very adversarial picture of China and many of our current geopolitical adversaries. So are you saying that there's no hope for collaboration in scientific advancement, technological research, in any causes from climate to diseases to anything that AI and its computing power could make revolutionary breakthroughs in, medical research as well? Are you saying that this relationship with China in the real world has just poisoned any chance of any detente or proactivity in the digital world as well?
No, that's a great question and a very important question. And I think what I would say is humanity, and this goes way beyond this, way beyond the topic of this panel discussion or this conference today. But I think what should be obvious to anybody is that humanity has an interest in collaboration, particularly on climate change and global public health, as we saw through the COVID pandemic, and a whole host of other dynamics such as AI, and go down the list. In my view, technology, and so long as it's geared toward dynamism, freedom, liberty, innovation, These are the values, and I don't mean to sound cliche, but these are the values of the United States and our market democratic allies. Innovation, liberty, expression, based on a rule of law that derives from the consent of the governed. I mean, this is sort of like basic civics 101. The thing that I'm concerned about, once you get beyond climate change and global health, and just drop a footnote there, China, the PRC does not have a very good record when it comes to helping the world avoid a pandemic. So I'll just like drop that as a footnote. It can be a topic of another conference. But once you get beyond those basics, it seems pretty clear to me that as distinct from freedom, liberty, innovation, dynamism, expression, the way the PRC and the Russian Federation and the Ayatollahs in Iran and the Kim regime in North Korea, the way they view the world is through the lens of control and social control. That's what AI and data and therefore 5G can allow, unless we are affirmatively leaning into making sure that these innovations lead to greater liberty, greater expression, greater choice, greater self-governance, greater application of the rule of law. If not, it leads to social control, where in the real world, China is using data and AI to repress Uyghurs, and it's using AI to put social credit scores on all of its billion-plus citizens. And that's I think the divide. So with regard to technology, not ready to concede that we're heading into a tech Cold War and a totally bifurcated war between tech Cold War between the US and its allies and the China-led authoritarian world. But frankly, I don't have an answer for what's the alternative now. I don't know how you can, given that the China's purpose in propping up TikTok and Huawei and all of the other national champions is control and total information awareness for the purpose of control. I don't know how we transcend that, particularly when the backdrop of it is China allying with in a tacit alliance with Russia with regard to Ukraine and Iran and Hamas. I don't know how you square that circle. So I'm much less optimistic about it than I've ever been. So I might just leave it there, but I think that's the future. The dichotomy, the real dichotomy of our national security is how do we leverage this technology for purposes of peace, rule of law, dynamism, solving challenges like public health and climate change, and individual liberties and opportunity.
Thank you, Clete, very much. Although we are at a Jesuit university, and having gone to one myself, they never give up and are not averse to continuing to try to bring disparate viewpoints together. So maybe some optimism, but it sounds like if different countries are on different pages in terms of the objective of the collaboration, I think that sounds like the reason why he's not quite so optimistic. But
well, Carolyn, I'll just add one other thing to that. The reason for optimism is that if dynamism and market democracy and rule of law and all of these values that we try very hard, frankly, against human nature to advance, if they are corralled and channeled, it's an exceptionally powerful force. as the Soviet Union found, you know, it wasn't blue jeans and rock and roll that won the Cold War, but it was the economic dynamism combined with the military strength of the United States and its allies that basically showed the Soviet Union and the rest of the world, this is the way that it works. It doesn't work that way. But the pendulum is swinging back a little bit, and I think China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are banking on the fact that U.S. style market democracy doesn't work as well as our way. And so I think the way to collaborate is to, you know, hopefully peacefully show the world this is the way to do it. It's through dynamism and rule of law and true competition in the market. That way works better than a top-down authoritarian approach.
A perfect way to end this session. We can go and get a bathroom break, get some water, some coffee, some treats. But first, please join me in thanking Clete for joining us.
Thank you, folks. It's great to be here, and kudos for this initiative. Thanks so much, Carolyn and Jen.
Okay. We are going to get started on our panel discussion and pull together some of the threads that you had heard in the first two portions of our program. I am Carolyn Brandon from the Georgetown Center. I think I forgot to say that at the beginning. But thank you for coming anyway. Peter Rysavy of Rysavy Research is joining me. We've got Jennifer Fritzsche, Greenhill Partners, Roger Entner, Recon Analytics, and Ambassador David Gross, WileyRein. What I wanted to do here is let's start off and hear from an expert who has lived through this many times to explain to us exactly what this thing I referenced, the World Radio Conference is, what it's about, who goes, what happens there, what happens after they're done. Are they ever done? Ambassador Gross, thank you very much for joining us. You are considered one of the experts on all things international communications. And I was wondering if you could help us understand a little more clearly exactly what is the World Radio Conference, who's going, what happens there, and what happens when everyone leaves Dubai.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's great to be back at Georgetown. All of the issues you generally hear about on Spectrum are domestic. That's where the fights are. That's where the action is. That's where the upside is. That's where the downside is. And you've heard a lot about that from our previous two speakers. But to take a step back, Spectrum, of course, doesn't conform to national boundaries. And so quite rationally, the governments of the world have to worry about these spectrum-related issues from a more global perspective. In Geneva, there is the International Telecommunication Union, which predates the UN, but is now a part of the United Nations. And it was created about 150 or so years ago, really in the days of the telegraph. It's morphed to telephone. And now one of its core responsibilities has to do with spectrum. It is complicated because people often think of the ITU as being, in essence, a global FCC, and it is not. It is not a regulator in that sense. But it does do a number of things that are important for spectrum-related uses. And that's where the World Radio Communications Conference comes in. The conference is a gathering. We used to treat it as a treaty writing gathering. Now it's not a treaty writing, but it creates a document that has legal effect, international law effect. It is a gathering that happens every 3 to 4 years. It's not on a regular schedule like many ITU meetings, which is every 4 years. And it is a gathering where governments come to discuss how spectrum ought to be used both terrestrially and in space. We haven't talked about space very much, but let me just talk about that, touch on that, because that's actually where the ITU probably has its greatest authority from a regulation type of perspective. And that is, it is the entity in the world that controls orbital slots for satellites. And in the case of LEOs and others, how the positioning should be done so you don't have interference issues, so you don't have collision issues and things of that nature. For many years, up until relatively recently, satellites were a fairly quiet part of the discussion. But now, of course, with SpaceX and with Kuiper and others, it's become a very big part of the discussion, whether it's about broadband globally and about others. The ITU plays a critically important role with regard to that. The World Radio Communications Conference, where the world comes together, sets basically the rules of the road with regard to certain aspects of spectrum, including satellite spectrum related issues. So it's the satellite part of I think the discussion there has become increasingly important. There is, of course, a great deal of focus on the fact that it discusses terrestrial spectrum. But the piece that people often miss about terrestrial spectrum and the WRC is that constitutionally, the ITU, by treaty, every country is sovereign. So therefore, the ITU cannot tell countries how to regulate and deal with spectrum within their boundaries. That's up to the FCCs of the world, ministries, and the other. But it does have a very important part because it basically tells both regionally and globally governments how they agree that certain types of uses are best uses of that spectrum. And that becomes very important because whether it's for manufacturing or for other purposes, the larger the market, the better the economies of scale and scope and the like. So from a US perspective, the US prepares for these conferences very strongly. It takes the entire 3 to 4 years to prepare. There are a lot of technical studies that are done to try to figure out how spectrum ought to be used, what the interference characteristics are and the like. And then the US creates a delegation that is, in our case, made up of government officials, always led by the State Department or State Department person, but it has FCC, NTIA, Department of Defense, others, NASA involved. And then also, in our case, we have a large part of the delegation are from the private sector. So we have almost always the largest delegation, over 100 people, virtually always at a WRC. It lasts for almost a month in some exotic location, Geneva. This year it's going to be in Dubai. Of course, it always seems to interfere with Thanksgiving, so it's not the easiest time for Americans to be away, but it is critically important. It is probably the thing that determines business models and whether they are business models are going to be successful or not, because so many business models depend on spectrum, and particularly from a global perspective. And those decisions that are made at the WRC are extraordinarily important. And then lastly, I would say the other piece of it is at the very end of the conference, and these conferences are always very difficult. There's a lot of money on the table. There's a lot of national security issues on the table. I had 2 WRCs I was responsible for when I was at the State Department. One of them was in 2003 in the run-up to the war in Iraq. I cannot tell you how difficult it is to negotiate with countries in the Middle East about the repurposing of radar spectrum, basically where you have to go and explain to countries why you want to use spectrum to bomb them. That doesn't go along very well. It's not well received. But obviously from a DoD perspective, these things are very important. And so we will have a very difficult time at this conference. I will also just mention that there's always a Palestinian-Israeli issue at all these major conferences. That's including at WRCs because of the spectrum used by the Palestinians, which is controlled by the Israelis because Palestine is not a member state. This will be a very difficult conference for that reason, among others.
I'm wondering, is there any chance that the conference gets delayed or
No.
pushed off in light of what's going on? No.
I mean,
Okay.
there's never a zero probability of anything happening. An asteroid could hit the Earth
Right.
and move the conference, but not because of the events that we are aware of today.
Right.
The Israeli Gaza problem won't affect it in that sense. The Ukraine problem won't affect it in that sense. So I would not anticipate it being moved.
So two quick questions. One, what sort of signal, or maybe it's not a signal, is the U.S. sending directly or indirectly by not having a domestic regulator who has the ability to auction spectrum? Is that at all taken into account in terms of our global position?
Not really. I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to minimize the importance of that. It's embarrassing. It's difficult. Nobody likes that. But that's really an inside the beltway type of problem. Whether or not people in Beijing are really worried about that, whether people in Geneva are really worried about that, or Brussels, not very much.
And then any top line headlines that we would expect to come out of the November meeting?
Yeah, I would say yes. There'll be a couple, and I think part of it is there are obviously a bunch of issues having to do with satellites that will be very important. There will be a lot of discussion about 6G, whatever the hell that's going to end up being, and therefore, what I think, keep your eye on not necessarily just what is decided at the conference. And there are lots of obviously very difficult issues about that. Issues about unlicensed spectrum versus licensed spectrum, 6 gigahertz. Those things are obviously very important and very timely. But I would keep your eye on, at the very end of the conference, at the end of every conference, is when everyone's just totally exhausted, that there's a decision made about what the future agenda items are going to be. This will be the discussion about what will be worked on between the end of this conference and the next WRC, which will be in 27, I believe. And that will be very important. What is put on that agenda? Because if it's not on that agenda, it gets very hard to move. Not impossible, very hard to move other things. So what's on there is usually the sleeper issue, but usually the big issue.
And so without getting into a great deal of detail on the exact items that are being discussed and debated in Dubai, I think as we all know, just from reading the articles in the trade press, it appears that the U.S. government, the U.S. delegation, has taken a position on 1 of 7 items, I believe. So the question procedurally is, if a government does not take a position on an issue on the agenda, does that mean they do not vote for or against it? They essentially abstain, or what is that? What's that process?
No, I would. So we will. I think the U.S. delegation almost always has positions on everything. In fact, more so than most governments do, because we have a very large delegation and large interests. So I would anticipate that we will have a formal position, we being the United States, will have a formal position on virtually every item that will be up. They're still working on it. There's often this sense that somehow we're not as well prepared as we ought to be, and that may be an unfortunate view. My experience is that because of the complicated nature of most of these issues, and the divisions domestically on many of the important issues, that it is not until much closer to the conference that the final decisions on the difficult issues are made. And those are often made at the White House. I mean, these are important enough. So if you don't have interagency consensus, someone has to make the call. And ultimately, the call is made by the head of delegation. So it's not a surprise that you would have some lack of clarity on some issues, but the delegations have been going around now for many months, having meetings with governments around the world, hearing what they're interested in, but also explaining what's important to the U.S.
Thank you. So let's get into some specifics on frequencies. Here in the United States, there are conversations between the industry and other holders of spectrum in the 3 gigahertz range. I think there's been lots of articles discussing the 345 to 355 and the lower 3.1. Peter, I want to turn to you. Can you tell us a little bit about where the US stands on some of these big blocks of spectrum that other countries are looking at for 5G, 6G and beyond? Are we in the same kind of looking at the same range, or are we potentially in a different place?
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, but I'll try and simplify it. First of all, you should realize that as technology improves, we can harness frequencies that were not feasible before. So once upon a time, sub 1 gigahertz was considered beachfront spectrum, and everybody wanted it. Now it's just a coverage layer, and most of the bits are flying in what we call mid-band frequencies. That's about roughly 2.5 to 6 gigahertz. There's no exact definition. Currently, for 5G technology, where the technology is at, that range represents the optimum performance and coverage for the technology. So when users experience hundreds of megabits per second of throughput on their smartphones, they're using the mid-band layer. The US does overlap other countries in mid-band, and the key mid-band frequencies right now are from like 3.1 to almost 4 gigahertz. That is worldwide where most of the action is for 5G. The US, however, has diverged somewhat because we put CBRS, one of our big grand spectrum experiments, right in the middle of it, 3.55 to 3.7 gigahertz. And nobody else in the world is doing that. Furthermore, we stop right now at 3.45 gigahertz on the low end, whereas other countries in the world have been able to license all the way down to 3.3. So there have been discussions between industry and the Department of Defense about trying to make that lower portion available, and right now it does not look very encouraging. So because of not being able to go down as low, not having the full band for commercial 5G networks because of the CBRS portion, we are a little unique in those mid-band ranges. And then also looking forward, for example, in the 4 gigahertz band, a lot of countries in the world are moving towards allocating those frequencies, and that also looks challenging for the United States. So right now we are on a path that is not entirely encouraging.
Roger.
Yes.
Roger.
Yes.
When we were chatting earlier, I think there was a question: has there ever been an instance where a country did, in fact, from a factual perspective, become a spectrum island? And I thought you and Peter were quick to identify, while a previous instance where maybe the United States went in a slightly different direction. Can you talk to us about what that instance was and what the ramifications were of us going in a slightly different direction than where the rest of the world was?
Sure. The incidence is when the US used cellular spectrum in the 850 megahertz, and with PCS 1850. The rest of the world uses 900 megahertz and 1900. It's almost the same. There's a little bit of overlap, but essentially they were two different approaches. And in the beginning of wireless, both 1G and 2G, these devices did not work overseas when Americans traveled overseas and vice versa. So people had to rent devices. And as a result, the US also had more expensive devices because the volume of devices sold in the US was a lot smaller than sold in the rest of the world together, that coalesced behind the 1800 megahertz configuration. And so, Ambassador Gross mentioned it earlier, that when you have one technological solution, you have higher economies of scale, lower prices, faster innovation, and it's a flywheel that goes faster and faster. Thank God we have overcome that, both technologically, that devices that we figured out how to make magnetics that have all of them combined, but it came at a higher cost. It took time, all of these things. So if we become a spectrum island again, people will wonder, like, when I go overseas, why don't I have access to whatever the people who are native in the country have? Because simply, either ours doesn't work and cannot access that because the device that is sold here doesn't have the electronics for it, or it's not working as fast, right?
David?
Yeah, I think one other thing to think about as you think about it as an island is, on the one hand, technology has helped bridge that so that you don't really feel the same thing. And yes, there may be a cost, but it's, and I don't want to minimize how important that is. Where I think where it becomes a real problem for many of the carriers is actually on our border. So, for example, with Canada, generally things go pretty smoothly with the carriers, and they can, for a variety of technical and economic reasons, they get along very well. I would say the Mexican border has always been a very difficult problem. And the Mexicans, for example, went with a more Asian approach than ours. And so you see real technical issues, interference related issues and the like in the border, some of which have national security and private and safety issues as well. So there's some real world difficult issues, even apart from the fact that we've done very well technically.
Yeah, and we still have that problem today in the 800 megahertz spectrum, right? There's this discussion about, will Dish buy the 800 megahertz spectrum from T-Mobile or not? But when we look at it, this is 7 by 7 megahertz in the United States. On the border, it's only half of that, because both Canada and Mexico didn't reband the SMR band like we did, but they didn't buy into the agreement that Nextel at the time did, that it's interfering with everything. And apparently what interferes in the US doesn't interfere in Canada and Mexico. Funny how that works or not work, right? So we still have these challenges now. So Dish, for example, if it buys the spectrum, or whoever buys the spectrum, has only half in places like San Diego, Brownsville, Detroit, all the big border cities. So that's also a consequence of not harmonizing with the rest of the world.
So, Peter, I know you have talked often and have written about the 5G and the standards and the capabilities of 5G. Could you tell us a little bit about, share your thoughts on this issue of channelization? It seems like the rest of the world, and I think recently China, when they were talking about making lower 6 available for their 5G and 6G, they specifically mentioned the ability to have very wide channels in that band. And they saw that as a very big advantage and a desirable outcome for what they're doing on capacity and speed. Can you tell us a little bit about why are wide channels relevant? And if we end up going in a different direction than where the rest of the world is on things like 3 or 4, as you described, the sweet spot for 5G, what does that mean in terms of are we losing out on the technological and innovative benefits of having those wide channels if we are out of step where the rest of the world is on spectrum bands?
Wide channels are really important because they translate directly to the user experience. So there is a concept of spectral efficiency that's bits per second per hertz. So the more hertz that a user device is harnessing, the better the throughput performance. And 5G has been designed to be extremely flexible. It operates in low bands, operates all the way to, or at least the standards bodies have defined operation all the way to 71 gigahertz. And it also accommodates a wide range of radio channels. So sub 7 gigahertz, which is called frequency range 1 for 5G, radio channels can be as wide as 100 megahertz. That's extremely wide compared to 4G LTE. The maximum radio channel in that technology was 20 megahertz. So at 100 megahertz, the user gets throughput rates of almost up to, or sometimes exceeding, a gigabit per second. So the performance relates directly to the size of the channels. Now, one thing that radio innovators have accomplished is something called carrier aggregation, where you can combine multiple radio channels, for example, 3 or 4 radio channels of different size. Some might be 10, some might be 20 megahertz, and you can build up a larger radio channel through carrier aggregation. However, the net efficiency is much lower when you do carrier aggregation. So, for example, one study, and this is in my report on 5G midband spectrum, shows that the cost per megahertz of operating with 20 megahertz channels is like 70% greater than using 100 megahertz radio channel. So being able to license these wide channels is absolutely critical for the success of the ecosystem. I think those are part
I was
to your question.
No. Thank you. I was just trying to figure out how to communicate with the folks next door vacuuming, if they could please turn it off till we leave. But I apologize. Can you guys hear okay? All right. I'm not quite sure what they're doing next door, but they decided now was a good time to clean. So quick question, Roger, back to you and then Jen. Fixed wireless access, depending on who you talk to in the investment community or even at the companies, they've got different ideas about, is there, what kind of business case is there around it? And a lot of the folks, even who are providing fixed wireless access, are saying that, it is dependent in how proliferating or how much it proliferates is going to depend on how much spectrum. And it sounds like one of the value propositions the companies are making is, am I better off deploying my spectrum for fixed wireless access, in which case I'm taking market share away from cable and others, or is it a better use of my spectrum to keep it, truly in a mobile network? So the question is, if we're off on a somewhat spectrum island in the sense that the rest of the world is looking at the lower 3, they're looking at 6 gigahertz for full power commercial, and we are not. What sort of implications does that hold for fixed wireless access really taking, it is taking hold, but really taking off and becoming something that is marketed very heavily in all around the country?
So when we look at fixed wireless access, it's the 5G killer app that we were all looking for, and it was staring in our face. Currently it absorbs, or it takes like all the growth in the broadband market, residential broadband market, and it's essentially monetizing idle spectrum capacity, and every wireless carrier has at times idle capacity. And so its intended or unintended side effect, it depends. From a regulatory perspective, the FCC talks a lot about bringing more competition to different markets, right? The cable companies have entered the mobility market and are growing here as fast as all the other the host carriers combined. On the other hand, FWA has brought competition to the broadband market, where regulators have for a long time complained that there's only 1 or 2 players. Suddenly we have 4, 5 players in a very cost-effective way, right? And so it all depends on the intent of the regulator if it wants to stimulate competition in these markets further, or if it wants to stifle the competition. And that dictates, or that's the effect of allocating more spectrum for mobile here.
Jen, as an investor now, putting on your kind of investor slash analyst hat for a second, and you are looking out at the mobile industry, and as you know, Marc was saying, it's what, a 1.3 trillion still to be spent on build out, et cetera. As an investor, do you feel confident over the next 5 to 10 years that there will be enough spectrum in the commercial space, in the commercial networks, where there will be continued growth and it makes sense to invest in this space? Or do you have any concerns after listening to some of what we were talking about today?
So I think that from a spectrum standpoint, there definitely needs to be more. I would probably disagree with what Marc. I think it's very top of mind for AT&T. I mean, and others like it. I would echo Roger's point that fixed wireless is really interesting right now. To put some numbers around it, it accounted for 80% of all broadband subs in the second quarter. So I think that, the bet is that carriers like Verizon and T-Mobile, who've been the most aggressive in fixed wireless, are going to run out of spectrum. I think we have to appreciate that the C-band spectrum, which Verizon bought, they bought as much as 200 megahertz in several markets. You guys probably know the specifics more than I do. And having been involved in that auction myself, I can tell you that they're just getting access to that B-band spectrum like this week. A check was written to the satellite companies yesterday. So I mean, they're getting their hands on a lot more spectrum, which is going to make those channels that much wider. And like how Peter described it, I always think of it as like driving in Atlanta, if anyone's done that, like there's 7 lanes to that highway versus a country road. And that's the wider that channel, as you said, much more eloquently than I am, but it allows for just much more capacity. And so I think if you're thinking like Verizon doesn't want to just be your wireless broadband solution. They want to be your broadband solution, period. So while I sit in Chicago, which is not a landline Verizon market, they want through fixed wireless for me to embrace that and ignore my cable bill. And because I've been a Verizon wireless customer, a loyal one for 15, 16 years, it's a brand that I'm comfortable with. And it becomes a question of, is my loyalty to Comcast or is my loyalty to my wireless broadband?
Or to the lower price?
That's a very good question. And I think it's all a question.
Roger, can you talk a little bit? I don't want to interrupt the thought you were about to express. So first that, and then my question is, we've been really focusing here on consumer. Can you talk to us a little bit about the enterprise market in the United States and sort of the growth potential there?
So, and they go into each other. So we do a lot of research in the wireless and in telecom space in general. So we backed into can actually T-Mobile and Verizon make their goals, and Verizon said that they would by 24, by the end of 24, get about 5 million customers on FWA, and T-Mobile was about 7 to 8. And when you back into the data and how much spectrum there is, all of that, they can comfortably get there. And I spoke with Joe Russo, who runs the Verizon network at MWC, and he was already talking about doubling that. That's his long-term goal. When we look at customer satisfactions, we run the largest telecom surveys, period. We interview every week 4,000 wireless customers, 4,000 home internet customers about their preferences. And we ask them how happy are they with their numbers. And FWA wins over fiber. The satisfaction numbers are higher. Even AT&T that just launched 2 months ago their FWA offer, their FWA satisfaction is already at par, if not slightly higher than that of their fiber product, which beats cable and DSL all day long. So the satisfaction is very high with this product too, even though that from a raw technical perspective, it doesn't deliver the bandwidth and the latency and that fiber does. Technically, fiber is by far the superior solution, but the convenience is by far higher, and it seems to be, at least right now, good enough. And the speeds that are being delivered are in the 200 megabit range, which is roughly what Cox is offering to their cable customers. Now, we also interview, more than 1,000 businesses every month about what they do in the technology space, and almost every single business is experimenting with FWA. Now, more and more of the smaller the business, the more they're relying already on FWA. Larger companies, understandably, are trialing it more. And we also find that in the beginning, companies are using FWA as a backup solution. And the smaller the company, the more quickly they have transitioned from using it as backup to using it as their main connection. Also for price and for convenience, because FWA, if you need a fiber, if you need a cable, a fiber, you name it, solution, and you open a store, it takes weeks. You can go into a store you name your FWA provider, get the box, bring it to your location, and within a minute or two, this thing works, right? So the time to open a facility, that whole convenience has been revolutionized through FWA.
So I know that we have, it's about 5 to 12, and everyone has been very patient and listening diligently online and otherwise. So I don't want to keep everybody here much later than noon. So I was wondering if we could do kind of like a rapid fire. I know you love to do this, Jen, so I figured I'd borrow one of your tools. And on this topic, so just to bring us current in our discussion. So we heard from Marc Ganzi. This is a very vibrant, very exciting time in the mobile space, I would say, both here in the United States and around the world. When we talk about mobile up here, we're talking not just about, consumer connections, but the entire ecosystem, which also includes enterprise users. We heard from Clete Johnson from a national security and military perspective that, one of the biggest holders of spectrum in the United States is the Defense Department, but it has a critical mission. And obviously the commercial industry, as he reminded us all, doesn't want to usurp that. So the question is, how can we move forward to find spectrum in the United States that might be encumbered, but through the FCC could be reallocated? But then for our panel, what we did was we went outside the US. So it's one thing for us to figure out how we're going to repurpose or make use or do more efficient things with what we've already allocated here. But then the other question is, what about in the future in terms of other bands of spectrum that are not currently allocated for commercial use? What does it mean if the United States goes in a different direction? And I think what we heard probably most succinctly was in our history, there was an experience where the United States, US companies went in a slightly different direction. The difference in the bands was rather small compared to the differences that we're potentially looking at. For example, if the rest of the world authorizes full power commercial use in the lower 3, that is not something the US commercial industry is going to get access to here. DoD has made it very clear they have particular missions domestically that are different than internationally, even though they are operating on those bands next to commercial operations in Europe and around the world. But as they've explained to the companies, that's just not something that can happen here in the United States. So the question is, where the heck is new spectrum going to come from? And it sounds like the rest of the world might be going in a slightly different direction than where the US is right now. So what is the rapid fire question? The rapid fire question is, what do you think the US government could do, whether that's at Department of Commerce and NTIA, the FCC, the White House, Congress, combination of all of them? What could we do to head off running out of capacity because of a lack of spectrum? Number one. Number two, avoid finding ourselves on a spectrum island. I'll start with you, Peter, simply because you're closest.
Okay. Well, it's quite simple. We need a well-defined spectrum pipeline that is deep and harmonized with the rest of the world. And that right now, if we look at advanced 5G capabilities and 6G should be everything, we should be looking at everything from 3 gigahertz to like 16 gigahertz. That's where all the action is going to be over the next 10 years.
Make it to Clete that.
Well, following the international course would be the most prudent way. The last time we did not, move in lockstep with every other country. It was not to our advantage.
I'm going to answer a slightly different question. Stepping back, what are we, and looking ahead, what's different? What I would say is that for the past 30 plus years, the commercial use of spectrum has been in great ascendancy, and the benefits, the societal benefits have been enormous. As cellular, in the early days of cellular, people didn't recognize how important it was going to be. We have lived in this age in which everybody now lives on wireless. Looking ahead, that will continue to grow. But what we see in Ukraine, what we see in Gaza, is that the military aspects of spectrum are in the ascendancy as well. And so the traditional trade-offs of trying to find commercial spectrum from previous military uses and defense-related uses, we may be hitting a much more difficult time. And so perhaps to answer your question, if I were advising the US government, as I sometimes do, and Congress, I would say spend a lot more money on basic research, because only new and innovative approaches is going to solve this problem for us. The old zero-sum game of sharing or taking it from one and giving it to another, it turns out probably in the long term not to be sustainable.
As always, you had the final, very good closing remark. Does anybody have any questions before we close for any of the speakers? Nick? Not Nick. You're not Nick. Please introduce yourself, though.
Joel Thayer with the Digital Progress. So as we go into World Radio Conference, I'm sure you guys have heard of it. We are seeing a lot of activity from NTIA, which is the subordinate Department of Commerce, noting that they have certain successes. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that they've actually argued that CDRS is a legitimate way forward for some of these lower bands, which is kind of new for them in a lot of ways. But what's your take on NTIA being able to comment or specifically argue for, well, seemingly argue for something that's in the commercial space, which is usually for the FCC to do? And is there anything that you can point to as a legitimate success at WRC, or is it all for naught?
Those were a few questions.
I wanted to jam that.
How about process-wise? Process-wise, is there
Why is everyone looking at
in
me?
terms of interagency coordination and sort of who's in charge of the delegation?
Right. So, the NTIA role is a complicated role, and under Alan Davidson, and with Scott Blake Harris and so forth, they've really, I think, upped the game a lot for them on spectrum-related issues. But of course, NTIA is, in theory, the primary coordinator on the federal side, as compared, as you point out, where the FCC does the commercial. All that flows in, but ultimately, if there is an inability to find consensus between NTIA and the FCC on particular spectrum for the WRC, then ultimately it's up to the State Department to make the final call as to what our position will be, in close coordination, obviously, with the White House. They don't make it up by themselves, but they're the ultimate decision maker.
Yes.
Just a quick question. Does anyone on the panel have a comment on the subject closely related to speaker frequency, and that is congestion in the low Earth orbit? Is this a topic for the WRC? Is this, because it's closely related without being able to deploy satellites? Frequency is being, so is there any comment on that?
Yes, the answer is yes. These are issues. Orbital location issues are a core aspect of what the ITU does focus on. Obviously, administrations have the licensing responsibility, so there's a lot of work that's done between them. One of the pieces that often people don't focus on is that there's something called the Radio Regulation Board at the ITU, where appeals decisions that are made by the staff can get appealed. The appeals from that go to the WRC. So you might expect increased work in that area as well, as you find those difficult decisions being made.
All right. I think that is it for the day. Thank you all for being here with us. And thank you to my speakers. Really appreciate the time and the insights. Stay tuned for closing remarks from our very own Professor John Mayo.
So I'm John Mayo. I'm a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown, and I am the host here today in the sense that I'm the executive director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to be uncharacteristically brief. Normally I speak for an hour and 15 minutes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or an hour and 50 minutes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I will tell you simply say this, that I've been studying telecommunications for a long time, since the mid-1980s. And the discussion has morphed over time. It has moved from a landline-centric discussion increasingly into a wireless space. And with wireless, naturally, the discussion has turned to spectrum. Spectrum is tricky. Spectrum is messy. It's very difficult for economists, for business people, for lay people to understand. We can't touch it. We can't smell it. We can't see it. It becomes very difficult to think about how to fashion public policy in that space. So it is especially important, it is critically important at this moment when spectrum is so central to the advancement of the industry and our country, that we get some expert translators in place, like Marc Ganzi, like Clete Johnson, like our distinguished panel, to help us all understand this. So I want to thank all of them, and I especially want to thank Jen and Carolyn for organizing this event. This is the second Spectrum Summit, and as I sat and listened to it, I have to tell you that I was reminded of the old cliche that that sequels in Hollywood aren't normally as good as the original. I have to tell you, this one was better. If you were there last year, and with no offense for anyone that was there last year, this was better. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and look forward to the third Spectrum Summit. Thank you very much.